How was your days in the wilderness, Mark?
Excellent, but interesting having 1990s style broadband. In fact, there was data in the garden, but not in the house. And in the house, there was 1990s style broadband and no Wi-Fi outside. You had to walk to the top of the hill if you really wanted to call somebody. So it's a reminder how things have changed over time. And this is in, hardly the wilds of UK.
Sounds very hipster. Okay, I'm just getting rid of that. Hello, Chris.
Everyone.
So it's Monday, and us Europeans are an hour earlier. You guys change time this coming weekend, right? Yeah, so it's only this week, so it really doesn't make much of a difference. One thing I suggest we talk about a little bit today is text. We've talked a lot about XR, networking, working, all these things, but working on the book now, and I had a meeting today with Jonathan Finn, who's going to help with some copy editing and stuff, along with Mark, who's doing the kind of HTML side of things. One thing we tried to do, as we've all talked about, is make the book, not just this volume, but all of them more accessible, glanceable, navigable, all of that stuff. And it's always interesting. We talk about keywords, we talk about AI summaries. One thing I tested was I took one of the new articles into Google's Notebook LM. And there I already have all our books. And I said, does this relate to anything prior? Did a pretty good job of finding it and saying who and where, so it was citable. So I think we can do that this time. But of course, we will need some serious manual supervision so it doesn't make spurious recommendations. They have to be useful. But at the end of the day, when you look at an article, of course, if there is data, we can have a graph. If there is something that can benefit from a picture, there is. But when it comes to the text, it's still text. So we can really go further with that. And last thing on this is a lot of us don't like to write long form, me included, believe it or not, right? And it seems easier to have a dialogue like we have now rather than to write. But I realized, and this is very much also, Mark, thanks to you, editing and writing are almost completely unrelated tasks. Because to transcribe a book now is not that hard in terms of the software will do a really good job. That's the same as speaking, isn't it? Like let's say we speak paragraphs to each other. When we then go through the transcripts are awful. We stumble, we go on all over the place. The hard work is editing, and that's nothing new. That's been discussed many times. So I'm just wondering if there are any specific thoughts in the community on the act of editing and the act of reading, if there's anything we can do there, whether XR, 2D, 3D, 4D, or whatever. I don't know, just throwing that out there. Good timing with a hand up, because I was done, Fabien.
Hello. I think editing is more than editing in the sense that you don't just like chop parts and all. I think editing, with being text or even video editing or sound editing or whatnot, I think it's back and forth also with the audience, either the real audience or the imaginary audience. Yeah, you try to have like a theory of mind. How will people, do people even understand what theory of mind is, for example? If not, then I need to unfold it. If for this audience is obvious, then I can just skip it and assume it's understood. And I think editing is hard because of this. Like you need to go back and forth between your viewpoint, I try to share an idea, and the viewpoint of the listener or the audience, like, do they get it? Should I try to find another example, an analogy, anything that they can like grab on and relate to? And then if you do this properly, I want to say, then you can like compress, say, okay, that was all bullshit. Now the audience here gets it. I can just say that in one word, let's say. Or no, that's actually something complex. And I think that's why I'm saying it's back and forth between either the real audience, like here, people nodding or thumbs up, or the opposite, like they start to scratch their head or look at their phone or something else. So I think that that's one part that is hard because you need to try to see, to probe, to get some kind of getting outside of your own mind, basically, and get the potential perspective of others, which might be totally off. And then you have, I think, if you do a good job, well, if you're brilliant, maybe you don't even need editing because you've, I don't know, done that so many times, you skip those parts. But if you're like a normal person with a sufficiently challenging topic, then I think it's doing this again and again and again, iteratively, until like your presentation at the end is like, people just get it because you master that skill. But I think that, to me at least, that's the really challenging part. It's not just like little things like small concept or even like how do you say spell check or this kind of grammar, etc. Of course it's important, otherwise you might not be understood, but the bigger picture is what's the audience, what do they get or not, and then how to synthesize and eventually reorder. The part at the beginning might be at the end, etc. But again, all those decisions are based on the estimation of your audience getting it or not, basically.
It was really interesting you mentioned video editing as well, because at the end there you're referring to the difference between grammar, spelling and stuff. There is of course a grammar for video also. And you know, when you watch a TV show, it's like, why? You know, like if they cut too early and there is somebody walking past, or like even there's a grammar, and that's not the storytelling, the bigger storytelling. That's like, why did they, that was, you know, it throws you out or throws you in. Same thing. So there's two very great to be provoked there. One of them is back in the day with some people when we're in Croatia talking about all these kinds of things. This is like 20 years ago. Summaries came up. This was before, obviously, the modern AI, but you know, sophisticated summaries to be used by the author, not the reader. So when you go to publish a document, you can see the summary and see if it reflects what you thought you're saying. I could very well imagine employing LLMs as potential readers. You know, you write a very complex prompt for them and say, you represent a reader who knows this kind of stuff. What does this document communicate to you? Because we run out of friends to proofread, don't we? So that could, you know, because the AI doesn't actually do any thinking, but it might inspire you to do the writing. So that's a little thing. And the other thing is, I wasn't going to bring it up now, but you made me, Fabien, you forced me. Because you talked about, you know, compressing and expanding. The big thing that I've thought about with XR over the last few days has been the huge importance we're going to have on exactly that. You know, we're not going to have one knowledge graph and that's it, right? That's going to be messy and noisy. The act of how we hide and reveal, we've talked about a few times, but what I realized recently is it's a bit like origami. How you choose to fold things back for individual things will matter. Will something all over here go into a list and go away? Or will it stay and be toggled? That's part of it. But also the kind of things we're talking about that Fabien mentioned, if you have a glossary, where do you put the glossary, ideally? If there's supportive text on different levels, depending on what kind of reader you are, do you put it in the text, do you fold it around the text, etc.? I'm just looking at your thing here, Mark. Yeah, well, I know you're an AI skeptic, but it can be useful to do. Well, you're saying the software, actually, do you mind speaking that one, and then we go to Fabien.
Okay, yeah, no, I deliberately trying to say, I know sometimes some dyspeptic comments about it, but that's not the point I'm making, because I've often said, I think that, you know, a useful use of things like LLMs, machine learning, call it what you will, is interesting in giving a perspective. You know, have I said what I thought I said? But I'm coming to see also that it's only a machine's view, and the machines don't think like humans. And one of the big problems we have at the moment with the clever things we've built is that they may find things that we don't, but they also don't find things that we do. But we shouldn't take this as a one-size-fits-all. The point is not to say, oh, it doesn't do everything, therefore it's no good. No, far from it. And I think the point you brought up is really good about the fact that it can be useful to us, saying, does this say, at least to a machine reader, what I think it does? But I think we need to keep in mind in our rush to sort of find things that are time savers, to remember we also have to think about the human readers who don't read in the same way necessarily. And I think we also need, going back to your point about editing, something I was going to throw in the pile, I'm sorry, because I see Fabien is patiently waiting, would just say that editing also pulls apart in various ways. If you're writing documentation, such as I've actually just spent all this morning doing, fell down some rabbit hole, which, I pulled one piece of a document, it all fell to bits, is that it's actually quite difficult. If I was trying to essentially edit or copy edit an artistic piece, that would be different from something like an academic piece that's broadly going to be written, published once, and then not touched again, to the thing I've got this morning, which is 20 years worth of living documentation on an app that's lived over that time and changed through it, which is probably, as I've come to see, one of the more complex tasks, but interesting in the insights it gives to other things. Anyway, I'll stop there because Fabien has something to say.
Just a brief little thing on that, Mark. I think you need to start playing around with them, because if you tell an LLM, you represent so-and-so, what might such a person see? What might they need extra? The questions of what might be missing, it generally does, I'd actually say shock.
Yes, but also just be conscious of wish fulfillment.
Hang on.
That's what I'm saying.
Mark, yes, but the thing is, look at around this room. Yeah, we're all white males and whatever, but we also read very, very differently. So I'm not saying that we should just give this to an AI and we're done. Absolutely not. But we run out of friends to do checking for us. So it was just a rough idea of that coming back. I think we agree more than not. Anyway, Fabien, sorry about the back and forth there.
It was more, well, first, I'm always happy to play the AI skeptic. I think 99% of it is bullshit. I'm very happy to clarify. It's just, a lot of it is just hype. So whenever there is something that needs to be critical about AI, just put me on the spot. I'm always happy to complain, and I think rightfully so. Anyway, not going to do this right now. It's more to answer your question about the glossary. So for the anecdote, just before the call, I discovered a little utils called PDF images. Very creative name. It's been, apparently it exists forever. And basically what you can do is you have a PDF, so let's say a publication, and then you can get the images out of it, hence the name PDF image. And it's pretty cool, I think, for XR and for our work, because I think you take the PDF, you can have the entire page as is, let's say letter or A4. But if there are illustrations, you could imagine having them on the side so that you can manipulate them directly. Why do I mention all this in relation to the glossary? It's because, in my opinion, what I prefer is to have the viewpoint of the author, namely, let's say a PDF, A4, you cannot change anything rather, because if they did a good job in terms of design, everything they've done makes sense. The introduction is on the top, that's how you get there. The glossary maybe is interactive, you can click on a term and maybe it brings you to the right page, whatever. But the point is, and that's why I mentioned PDF images, I want the standard perspective of the author, and I want to be able also to, explode it if I need to. If I want to grab the images and put it on the side, if I want to copy and paste text, if I want to click so that I jump to the glossary. So I'm happy to, let's say, the flat page by page with, let's say, glossary at the end is only a starting point, in my opinion. And the more a document allows me to interact with it the way I want, like, for example, parsing it, or I have a link to the data set so that I can directly play with the data and confirm that the author is indeed right, or I can have, like, on the spot, have an idea and play with it. So it goes a little bit to bring interactivities to documents. In my opinion, that's the exciting part. If we can, by default, have nothing editable, but if somebody wants to dig in for, again, whatever reason, they have that option, and it becomes, let's say, malleable. It becomes something that you can play with. Then I think if people want a glossary at the beginning or the end, then they can do it. And then that, or even embedded, let's say, on it. And bookmark part of the glossary or whatever. I think if we can have basically both the default view and parts that can be arranged based on how the person reads it, and I think it's also more inclusive. Like somebody, for example, is colorblind, and they can increase or change or have a different affordance to it. So I think it's best for everyone.
Yeah, I very, very much agree. I mean, this is what I do. When you read in Reader, you can get a reader view, and that can be many different color combinations. If you prefer it white on black, that is what you get. So that is what I've been testing, and people really, really like it. So that is definitely the kind of, yeah, we're aligned on that one. But it comes down to some specific things too. By the way, Andrew, good morning. I see Dini is not here, which is fine. I know she's very busy on Mondays now. But did you maybe want to mention something about the kind of live demo you guys had the other day? Because that's very much the meat of what we're talking about, if you don't mind. Or
Yeah, actually, I wasn't there, so I don't know
Oh.
details yet. I'm going to be hearing about it from Dini after this meeting. So unfortunately, I don't really have updates for you.
Oh, you could have just made it up. Just ask ChatGPT. What was it like when we showed up?
Everyone loved it. It was amazing. They've been raving about it. Yeah, probably going to get a huge influx of people joining our meeting next week because of how much everyone was hyped for this.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so my programmers are right this week working on being able to have a separate typeface for code in the book. And that's been a huge pain. It's really annoying because obviously I pay for this stuff. So it may have to be a semi-hack, but we are at a point now that in the discussion of what we're talking about, excuse me, other than asking the authors of the articles to write additional stuff, we can design stuff for the 2D version and XR version of the book. So a lot of the notions we've had, if you have something specific, very cool to discuss it. Yeah, Mark, sorry.
I've got a thought that adjacent to the thing of glossaries, of course, is indexes, which again, problematic. It turns out that good index is normally done by a human because of what you leave out. Because anything mechanical basically tends to find too much, and we're back in the same problem, the unintended problem of inability to understand the semantics of the actual writing. But it's interesting nonetheless. I don't know what, I mean, we can have an effective table of contents because we're going to have a book of articles across very different subjects. But thinking back to your earlier point about, okay, so what extra affordances can we give people to find the way around? I'm not sure. I mean, I think glossaries of terms is useful. One thing that is, I think, very useful to do is to have backlinks on those. So everywhere that term turns up, to be able to go to it. I'm conscious that can scale badly if someone's used an acronym or not. So again, well, this is where a human editing function will say, okay, well, we'll scale it back. You know, we'll only do the first one page or something. That then, of course, is a nested technical problem. But just a thought there, and one other thing on this is that in trying to come up with sort of glosses and all sorts of affordances, one of the observations that I've made over some decades of watching people sort of do stuff with text is that the inconvenient fact is that you don't really know unless you're, or even if you're working on a text with which you have some familiarity, quite what you want out of it until the moment arises. So you can end up making an awful lot of side affordances that actually are an effort to make and are probably not used. So there's a sort of yin and yang of this, is that we can put stuff in, and I think it's worth trying because it teaches. We find out two things: was it nigh and impossible to produce, or if it was easy to produce, that's good to know. And then separately, was it actually any use to more than the occasional reader? Because like as not, someone will always find an interest in something. That's the sort of the bell curve distribution. But at the same time, if one's had to add a lot of content, say, to a work, and very, very few people use it. It begs the question of whether it's actually an impediment or actually something useful. Thanks.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. I mean, now that I have proper users for author, I have to juggle that on a weekly basis, often a daily basis, what is actually worth putting on the to-do list. But one thing that I tested last year was I did an AI version of the book where it was just an AI summary of each article, really small, but then it had a link to the original. So it was, if you had the original, you could click and instantly you would read that page. And it was okay. It's just I didn't do it in time for the publication of the book. So I'm wondering now what kind of front pages we should build. Fabien made me, through inspiration, in Reader, do it so, I think you all know, down arrow goes to the next article. So if an article has many pages, doesn't matter, down arrow goes to the next. The top left is always, on a 2-page print, always the title. Really, really bloody useful. But of course, only for people who use my software. Now is the chance we have. We can release the book in many, many different ways. You know, we literally own this collection. Individual authors own their pieces, but we own the collection, right? So if somebody wants to do a fully AI thing, maybe we should do that. If someone wants to do just an overview in XR, because remember what Andrew has built is not really designed easily to go from article to article. That's something we didn't think about, right? When you're reading one piece in the proceedings, there is no button that says next article. That's strange that we forgot, but it's also good because it means that we were not thinking paper turning. But now we have the actual data, we have the actual opportunity to do, big picture in the book. It's about 35 articles. I've written 5 of them, so there's 31. I'm missing 2 or 3. They are mostly small. I think the biggest one is 5 pages. Smallest one is a small paragraph from Barbara Tversky. I'm going to use that as an excuse to do what we've done before, which is to have some pages of lots of, people who are too busy. Give us a paragraph, we put it in, that's fine. And the authors, also who they are, will be interesting to provide maps of and so on. No.
I think your point about AI summaries was useful in that I think they've got to the point now where whatever one sort of hot take on them is, they're certainly of a level where you can probably produce them consistently. And I think we're at the point where we can then take a sort of more mature judgment. I mean, I think they're useful regardless. I think they're also at the point where, say, compared to 10 years ago, they're actually pretty polished, which allows one to take a more objective view, at least in the subjects where one knows a bit about what's being summarized, as to actually how helpful they are. So I think that's actually a good and genuine experiment. I mean, they can be both informative, but they can also be an interesting statement of progress. Yeah.
I just realized that some of the reading experiences in XR are actually really, really good. With your Vision Pro, you've got crisp text, you can read. But that clearly isn't the #1 benefit at the moment of XR, right? So for the sake of at least our thinking, maybe we take all 5 volumes as our knowledge set, and we try to build shapes already now. Right, so we do what Mark said, and we build literally many different 3D trees. One is just the authors, do they relate in any way? Then we do the clustering of data. It could be fun to put on the headset and have like 5 different shapes of the book, and then you find an article, and then you don't even necessarily have to read it in there, although Fabien just explained to us how we can if we go that far. I don't know, what do you think?
It goes back a little bit to what I was saying, that we need the actual data to do this, like anybody. I mean, a lot of people here have the skills to do it. Not everybody knows how to do all that, but if the data is relatively convenient to consume and reuse and remix and present, I think most people who would be a little bit on the verge, on the fence, like, I don't know, I have, like you said before, I'm busy. But if the level, the threshold to do it is like, oh, it's already parsed in different ways that make it, I don't want to say trivial, but much easier, then sure, I would suggest to not necessarily do even it in 3D, because that is not as inclusive as making it in 2D. A lot of people are able to do even like starting their spreadsheet, and if we give them the data in CSV or whatnot, they can already do, like, for example, I was asking basic data on the book, number of authors and whatnot, and if some of it is conveniently presented, and means we can still, if it's done again, if the result produced by those analyzed piece of data is also reusable, then bringing it to VR, to XR, and make it manipulable directly, let's say, with hands and whatnot, will be easy. But I would suggest to do it like, let's say, the old school way at first, just 2D, and eventually, if, for example, the output is images or JSON or whatnot, then bringing it to VR should be still easy.
So, Fabien, I may have to be in Paris in a week, meet you halfway. Can go through this, or Brussels, whatever. Yes, on all of that. What we may do, I keep going on about the whole mural thing. One view of the book could be one mural per book. I have done it in Reader, and it's not satisfactory because it is using Apple's Vision OS constraints. But I could easily imagine the Brandel style, the whole book, just that. Of course, it's a very limited set, but the whole point of what we're doing here is to inspire people. It's not to create a new industry. So it doesn't have to be, I would like things to connect, but they don't have to. So if we do that, that could be fun. And for that, maybe, what would we need? The HTML or rendered PDFs? What would be best?
Yeah, and both. Like a rendered PDF, a normal PDF. If you say links between things, then links in any format, really, like whatever. And as long as it's, let's say, on a shared directory that anybody here is might be interested in participating, and they contribute back whatever format they also prefer, then again, we share those building blocks. That would do. But I would advise against targeting XR, because I don't think it's, even though it's what I personally and professionally focus on, if we want this to be inclusive, both in the number of people who can actually consume it and people who can work on it, then I think splitting in 2 steps will bring higher quality content.
I am absolutely not interested in being inclusive. I'm interested in being provocative, because we are the pioneers. We're going to do a paper version of the book. There will be a PDF version of the book. There will be a book in Andrew's XR world, the articles as preceding papers. So that's taken care of. If we do something really wild, even if let's say even the Sloan people can't do it, screenshots will do nicely. Thank you very much. Talking of which, Fabien, I haven't gone through your screenshots properly yet. It's been a bit hectic. But yeah, so okay, so I'll try to put together the mural, at least for something. Timeline, yeah. So we do have a timeline in the back of each book that gets updated every year. Somebody finds an error, or somebody adds something. So this is in text, formatted nicely with year thing, and the grammar tends to be the same. So and so by so and so. We've talked about timeline many times. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, that's why I raised it, because it's consistently sort of raised and then it goes away. But, when you mention a mural, well, there's something that you can make a mural out of, either on a 2D substrate or an XR. It might be interesting, for instance, to see how our accumulated writing maps onto that. In other words, is it all clustered on completely one aspect of text, or does it look across the piece? But there is something the other attraction of it is that one can do something visual with it, which sort of goes back to the mural idea, because most of the other things we've talked about essentially take us into more text or more indexing or more glossing. And I was reflecting on what Fabien was said, and I think he's right. Part of the problem also is that it's all very well to be provocative, but if only a couple of people get it, then the downside is also that means quite a lot of people just walk away and think, I won't touch that again for a while, which is, hi Brian, which can be sort of unintentionally self-defeating. And I'm trying to think in terms of, well, if we want to give more affordances, what allows people to explore? And the problem so the hump you have to get over is to show people something that they're used to in a slightly different way, where even if it's not exactly center stage for them, they get that, oh, this is interesting, which leads them to the idea, not that everything should have this and we should have more of this, but we said we should have more of other things like this. In other words, they become more exploratory in their approach and they think about different aspects of interrelation, which then hopefully then feed back to us in our practice in terms of, okay, well, how do you fulfill that? Because first of all, they tend to turn up as ideas. We say, well, that makes sense. But trying to map that idea onto the sort of the tech and the understanding that we have is often complex at first go. Yeah.
So Brandel, good timing. We discussed a little bit about discussing text as text, not necessarily work in XR and all of that stuff. Now we're talking about our own book. We're talking about different things, how the people can get access to it through maybe AI summaries, AI generated this, that, and the other, as well as other things. Currently, we're talking about potential timelines. And we've also talked about the mural to make our book, each book into one mural, completely plain, exactly what you did for Bob Horn kind of a thing. And just before you got on now, I was making this point that we're producing the book in paper and PDF. We also have Andrew's World. We also have what Fabien is doing. So I think we should completely ignore people's opinion for the rest. We should be pioneers. We should be artists. If it turns out to be absolutely awful, that is a learned thing, because it is not intended to be, this is the way forward. This is intended to be, we looked here, there's a cliff, let's not go further. That was the kind of provocation that Mark was responding to. And now Fabien has a word.
Yes, to reply also to your initial provocation, if you say, or rather because you say we need to include artists and developers and whomever like, that's what I mean by being inclusive. Like if you provide only, let's say, a lockdown file format that people both conceptually and technically can't get anything out of, but let's say one person, then assuming that person is not all those things together, then I don't think it's the right way. So that's what I mean by being inclusive, is having, let's say, maximizing interoperability from different viewpoints that are not only technical, but are, let's say, different cognitive styles and skill sets.
Yeah, I think that needs to be a huge part of our effort for next year to enlarge the community in outside of that the kind of area we are now. Okay, and let's take a little bit longer to timelines. We talked about a lot. Brandel has built timelines, and Brandel has a comment.
I think Fabien was saying something similar to this. What the ground truth of a submission constitutes is going to set the terms for what seems to be natural and the most sensible for something. So if you ask people to say, you can provide whatever you want, but it's going to ultimately be represented in PDF, then that is going to sort of set high watermarks for what layout and arrangement are. If it's in LaTeX, then it's going to be much more limited. But if you say, submit what you want and we'll try to make sense of it, that's a much more challenging thing to sort of compensate for conceptually, but it means that people can submit things that are audiovisual or dimensional and other things like that. That's not to say that it's a suggestion that you do that right now. It's something that is better done with a little bit of forethought. But you know, the terms of submission set a frame of reference for what it is that people provide, and so if you say that something is text, and by text you mean ANSI, or Unicode UTF-8, then that's a very different thing than to say, and you can have JPEGs. People can make things that look very JPEG-y in UTF-8. I've got a friend who's made the most beautiful comments inside his path tracer with really elaborate, very well chosen ASCII art to describe in diagrammatic form the things there. But that is, very much against the claim. So yeah, I've got a jug. I will show it to you just because I think it's really awesome.
Yeah, the question of what, yeah, let's see.
Sorry. Thank you for bearing with me.
We can't
So
see
this
it.
jug is,
There we go. What?
This jug, it's in Celsius. Do you see?
Is that the joke?
Yeah. So 32 degrees.
Jug.
32 degrees is 0 degrees. 212 is 100. And all of those other ticks are the 10 degrees Celsius intervals. And so this jug design was in Celsius. And then people were like, oh, we need to put the Fahrenheit marks on there for Americans. And so then we end up with these awesome numbers. It's like nobody cares about those numbers, but they are 50 degrees, 60 degrees, 70 degrees, centigrade. I don't know, just the frames of reference make things seem sensible or not. And that's an important thing to think about as you're sort of setting the formalism of where things are going to reside within. So hopefully that made sense in the context, but I also just love this joke. I think it's so silly.
Yeah, that's cool. We have Brandel Unblurred today. That should be like a whole TV episode. Yeah, so we are thinking really towards text as being glyphs, being the alphabets, because I really believe that is where there is a lack of real innovation. The general workspaces, and we've talked about that, but we do obviously want to allow people to contribute in different ways. If someone comes with an XR piece to us, obviously that would be amazing, and we would try to accommodate it in every way, and then we'd flatten it for the flat versions of the work. But if we keep talking a little bit about the timeline. So there's two timelines in the books. One is the actual literal timeline at the end. The other one is the timeline of the contents. Would that be also on the side, to throw it out there? When you put the headset on a friend's head, and you mentioned that you're involved in this community, what is the kind of thing you would really like them to see? Not a rhetorical question. While you're thinking, just a hands-up question. Who has seen any of the Apple Vision Pro immersive 180-degree stereo videos at this point? Okay. So, Mark, you need to come to London, or I come to you. Chris, you need to see it too. For those of you who have seen it, in terms of seeing something like a play, like something you expect to happen in front of you, it is freaking amazing, right? The sense of presence is like nothing else. How do we translate that into that level of wow into what we're doing with text?
There's a readability to a medium when you develop past the threshold of being able to kind of parse and process it. I don't have it on permanently on tap for Shakespeare, but there have been times in my life when I've read through enough manuscript that I can kind of get just what's so beautiful about it, and it is. But it ebbs and flows. I haven't really done much of it since university, which is now very much in the rear view mirror now. But there's a tangibility, like I said, to a thing similar. I get a similar sense, like I was complaining to my friend about a neuroscience paper that somebody summarized just incredibly badly. And so I passed it to him, and he was able to kind of wade through and say, this is what the paper is saying. It has nothing to do with the summary. So that's crazy. And the paper is not particularly controversial in terms of what it is. And just the sheer meatiness of what it is that somebody can get out of the thing that they're good at looking at and good at reading is something that is just really striking for whatever field something is. And that's what I say at the beginning of my VR timeline, my Wikipedia VR timeline video, is that historians know these other shadow timelines, and the way to read timelines is sort of notionally and thematically rather than literally, like, I can see the tick mark here. So what I would be aiming for in the presentation of that is to, like, I've personally, and other folks here have read even more. I have read a lot about text in the last 10 years, a lot. And there's just a lot of really interesting color that gives any extra additional piece of information about text. There are set pieces, Ben Jonson, and all of these figures, Minucius, people like that, like, they're really important. And when you hear the name drop of them, then there's this whole, like, flowering of a conceptual frame of reference, so, like, of what it might mean to drop those names in there. And it would be really nice for people to be able to get something like that from being able to see what is meant and what is juxtaposed, and to be able to understand the latent possibilities of citing and referring and conjuring these things, for that to come up. Hopefully that makes sense.
It does make sense, and it goes into the soup of what we're talking about. Karl, do you mind reading what you just wrote? Because that fits in this bit of the discussion really well, and then I'm going to clobber you.
Sure. So I described text as a very functional medium. So function over form. Form still has its benefits, but the primary purpose of text, if you want to think of it that way, is to communicate information. So the wow factor for text typically comes more from what it is saying rather than how it is presented. So, like, for example, lorem ipsum, in a unique animated font may make you go, that's neat, but it probably won't make you go, wow. So if you want to push the wow factor for something that is text-based, you have to either present text that contains great content, or you have to make the functional aspects of the medium, which is like creating the text or reading the text, you have to make that process either better or unique in order to leave a lasting impression.
So I agree on half of that. I agree that people aren't going to read something that's not worth reading. Absolutely. The quality of the way that something is written also makes a huge difference. Absolutely, no question. But I think that text is an incredibly aesthetic medium. Because sorry, my other programs here wanted to chat, go away, right? Text has to be visual. Of course, there's braille and sound and so on, but in terms of this discussion, text is visual. And for me, it highlights a little bit about the differences of people in the group, which is really important and really great. That we have, there are some things that I really have problems reading because I find it too messy. I just give up on it. I may very well have levels of, reading problems, whatever it's called. But the combination is obviously key. Now we're moving into next year of authoring. And this is where these two things come together beautifully, of course, because it's very easy for me to talk about layout, fonts, and interactions and all of that stuff. The harder question, Karl, is of course what you say. How can people write better? I think of Zoolander, and to learn good, right? We may be able to help. One of the things, Brandel, we talked about earlier is using an LLM as a representative of a reader. You give them the text, and you've already given this LLM different personalities. Like, if somebody of this nature is reading it, what would you expect them to understand? And what might be missing for them? Obviously it will be imperfect, but it's not writing for you. It's just using a friend to give you feedback, right? So these are definitely the kinds of things, Karl, we should think about how to truly augment the thinking of the author, which is very hard to do, and it's a good challenge. Otherwise, we are just literally moving beautiful pieces of type around, and it can be beautiful. How does that, Brandel, that kind of side here into functional go back into your timeline thinking there, what you were saying earlier?
I was just typing to try to capture what I was thinking about. Yeah, I think that notion of functionality is kind of what I'm getting at. Like, there's an internality to what writing has the ability to stimulate. It doesn't always, but it does definitely have the ability. So, like, most people don't come up with ideas when they are watching Hollywood cinema. Whereas I think that what is being demanded of a reader is to cross-reference more actively the contents of their internal sort of model, the internal sort of set of concepts. And maybe that's because I'm just not a very visual person, but I feel like there is something that it's more, if it's more like internal process, then it has more ability to draw on it. Getting back to McLuhan's hot and cold to some extent. And so a timeline, what do you ask about the timelines? You said, what did you want to see out of a timeline, or?
Yeah, I did. I've been a bit distracted. Hang on, I'm going to show
Sure.
you my YouTube timeline now because of what Karl was saying. Let me just find something. Oh yeah, here we go. So our beautiful brains, as Brandel, you know extremely well, have different modes. There's the default mode. There is the paying attention to internal thought, external thoughts. I'm going to be writing this up in a simple paragraph in the beginning of the book to point out that, pardon my English, but we know fucking little about the human brain. I have to swear for emphasis. It is absolutely insane how little we know. Yet we make major decisions about our planet, other people, and from a point of arrogance. It's absolutely crazy. So the whole notion that Karl was bringing up, how the hell do we actually augment the author? It's such a multi-layered question. And Doug Engelbart, of course, would talk about human and social system, human and social and tool system as interrelated things. In all the communities I've been part of over the years, it's been either or, no matter what they say. Maybe we have an opportunity to look at both. You know, no tools are neutral. And if we look at just like a little tiny thing I put in the chat here, when we deal with our own book, first is how can someone find something worth reading? That is one task. How can they then read it? And I think that mostly comes down to the beauty of the typography and layout, mostly. And then we have the opposites, which is navigation away from it through citation or inspiration or implicit link. And then we have storing as annotations or notes, right? So there are some things we can do for the reader side. But on the author side, at a certain point, we want to make shapes, right? We want to have something like glossaries. We want to be able to write a concise thing, give it to the world in a shape, and someone can read it, maybe not visually 3D, but at least conceptually 3D, right?
Yes and no. I mean, the 3D-ness of it, I think, is a sort of incidental consequence of what we conceive of as being the most sensible sort of set of things. One thing that strikes me immediately when you say 3D is that something being a shape sort of implies a certain canonicality to the relative spatial arrangement of nodes, which may not be totally relevant if somebody needs to be able to kind of manipulate the arbitrary Levenstein distance, that's the distance between changes between things, to be able to kind of reach, walk across something. But if you know Wikipedia well enough, sort of the meta patterns that arise about how people kind of cleave and cut things up, then sometimes you'll actually walk across Wikipedia by clicking things rather than trying to just, type, search Google with Wikipedia for the article on philosophy or whatever, or you want to see how far away things are, stuff like that. Again, it reminds me of the way that I feel when I use Illustrator. So I've been using it for over 30 years. I was talking to some people about it at work the other day, and it has such a bizarre tangibility because it feels so much like internal capability. So it feels like flexing my fingers or being able to fold a paper plane. But there's nothing coherent about the spatial arrangement of that repertoire of actions or what I can understand. It's just that I understand what I can do with those things. So in a sense, yes, like it's like space. It's like having those things, but there's an inherent navigability and manipulability to that repertoire of skills that doesn't necessarily have to shake out as primarily spatial. What it needs to be is manipulable. What it needs to be is something that people have the ability to fully internalize, how they have the ability to leverage those things. And so that is the goal, and it might be worthwhile to talk about it in terms of being sort of primary spatial. I'm reading this really great book, The Notebook by Roland Allen, at the moment, and it's about it's about how people. It's a history of thinking on paper is what the sub byline is. So really interesting thing. He talks a little bit about commonplace books. What Anne Blair references in Too Much to Know. And he talks about how yes, that guy, it's great, huh? I don't know if you started, but I'm really enjoying it. It is 540 pages. I'm conscious of that, and I wonder if it should be about 100 pages shorter. But I'm having fun so far. But one of the things that he talks about is that in the 1300s, that Italians, particularly Florentinians and some other folks, started writing merchants in 4 notebooks. And they did it to have sort of significant differences between what they were doing in each of them, and to commit sort of these different processes and practices. And they weren't particularly high-minded. They weren't philosophical. They weren't theoretical. They were about how to encode profits and losses, and things to do with your family honor, and things to do with which pieces of information you liked and stuff like that. And the sort of practical consequence of that is that sort of set of actions was really put to a very mundane test for centuries, frankly. And if you read, I think Too Much to Know does a little bit of this. McLuhan sort of talks about it as well. Like a lot of the things that the Invisible College kind of came up with and invented had preceded them in commerce by sometimes centuries as practices for like, oh, we've got these things for numerical columns of numbers for how to do business. What about if we apply them to the interiority of mind, or how much it stretches a piece of metal if I drag it, and so on the one hand, I want sculptures, I want those things. But on the other hand, I think maybe we just pay a super close eye to what people have been doing as just dead mundane tasks on computing, and go like, what if we turn these tools back on themselves? What if we turn them back on text? And so then, the question is, for me, which is what I started with 10 years ago, what is Photoshop for text, and what is Blender for text? And Blender is, obviously for these intrinsically inherently 3D sculptures. But it's also not that they're much more than just 3D things. They're hyperobjects insofar as they can move and warp, and there are these multifaceted, multidimensional aspects to them. But yeah, so that's where I would go with what is a timeline, what is a map. It's is what makes these things, and how do we understand them, and how are the tools? How can we pull the tools that we use for editing text closer to the tools we use for editing Photoshop documents or After Effects timelines? Or, they don't have to be exclusively Adobe products, and probably it's better if they aren't, but it's just the ones I know the best. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
It does. It makes a lot of sense. And that's funny, Karl. In a way, I think I'm in a way repeating you, but I have to say it anyway. So I took a photograph. I want to share it with you because it's ready. Yeah, PNG. Okay, hang on. Just going to upload it because it's relevant for the story. And of course now someone's ringing the doorbell. I apologize. I'll be as quick as I can.
Well, I'll just throw something in, sort of relating to what you said, Brandel, about, you know, where's the Photoshop for text. And one of the observations sort of that comes out of work I've been doing just in, you know, recent decade or so, and working with people, is trying to get them to think about being present in the use of their tools. So it's not a case of, we're almost conditioned at the moment to a very production-oriented thing that, you know, I got this tool because it's better than that tool. This allows me to do this. And then the next question is, where's the button that does the thing that I want? So, okay, now you've reached the point where this isn't the tool for you. You want a tool that actually lets you do the thing that you want, at which point you say, but I don't want to do all the work en route. And there's a sort of chicken egg problem. And I do, that's another aspect, I think, to get out of, certainly breaking out of the thing where the tool tells you what to do, or there is a presumption that it can or will. It's quite freeing, but my experience is it can take weeks, if not years, to get people over that hump.
So, yeah, that's on the same thing. So please have a look at the picture that I put in the chat there. There is a point to it. If you look at that on a normal size monitor, you will see Edgar's eyes are completely in focus. You will see a very beautiful blurring. So these are all aesthetics. And we can make choices about aesthetics. But in terms of communicating, this was this weekend. We had a Halloween party. One of his best friends spent the night, so this is the next day. They're running around in the garden. That picture cannot be taken without the right tools, obviously, right? Oh God, sorry, programmer asking question. Boom. Right, so my point is, people like photographers and Adobe Illustrator people, we go to the camera store, we look at the lenses, we read the reviews, we get obsessed about the things that make things possible. Most knowledge workers, even very serious people, they download the Microsoft or Google product, they do their work, they make the assumption that the thinking happens in the head, maybe a few notes on virtual or real pen and paper, right? Which is absolutely crazy, because if you ask a sculptor to make a sculpture with only one chisel and one hammer, they're not going to give you very good sculpture. Right? Anybody who works with the physical world will know that choosing the tool is part of the job. Right? Anybody could have taken that photograph that I sent, even with an iPhone. You know, iPhones currently are insanely good, but they couldn't do it in that way. And that's what I'm trying to lead up to here. I have a choice, I have an interest, I have a perspective of I want it to be communicated and taken in that way. So when we then go into our knowledge tools, Mark asked a brilliant question up here. He said, what do you mean by augment? Augment what? We really don't know. If you're a cyclist, there are so many variables with the bike, the helmet, the equipment, that you will think about to get the right situation. But how do we even go about having the discussion around, you know, we have apparently something like 7 default kind of brain networks in our brains. We have certain human built-in capabilities. I'm not saying it's the right number, I'm just saying there is a number, it's not an infinite connection. We have all these psychological fallacies going on in our thinking, as we know about. We all have very different vision styles. I've noticed with author that people have incredible different needs for what they consider clear text. How do we even, as a community, define we should build better tools for the result of this? I tend to go back to Doug Engelbart's augmenting how we solve urgent complex problems collectively, which is great, but oh my God, it's vague. So within what we're doing now, what would our discussion look like to try to figure out that somebody who uses the tool that we want to invent, theoretically, in what way will they be able to think, which they cannot think now? You know, what is their 50mm 1.2 lens that I used compared to the built-in lens on the iPhone, which is the default. What are the extensions we're looking for? It's very hard to even try to think about, isn't it? Because we're trying to think about ways of thinking we haven't thought about. It's almost like trying to think, how can we become more intelligent? So, Fabien, derail me or build on it. Let's see what you got.
Yeah, I'll let you judge if it's derailing or building on it. I playfully said in the chat that I think Brandel meant GIMP or Krita instead of Photoshop. So if you're not familiar with this kind of tool, GIMP and Krita are open source software, meaning you can modify them if you can. It's not necessarily easy, but it's possible. I've done it a little bit with GIMP, which uses very popular scripting language called Lisp, which is made only of parentheses. And if you haven't tried it, it's in itself a mindfuck, which I still warmly recommend. My point, though, is I also linked a bit further down on there is a famous, I think, former VC or even still VC, Paul Graham in the Valley, who was writing a very short piece on the risk of delegating writing to LLMs. And I think it's a very dangerous path, precisely because I don't think writing is just writing. It's not like just dumping ideas, and it goes back a little bit to editing at the beginning of this very discussion, that by writing itself, you're thinking and hopefully thinking better. Like, for example, I cannot remember everything, but as soon as I put some of it on paper, then I can remember it for a different amount of time, a different time frame. And I have a representation of it, and I had to make it out of either words or drawings or anything. So again, the very process of writing itself hopefully makes me think better, at least differently than just whatever is going on in the mind. Can be a monologue, can be however people do this. And I want to say that I think tool making, so for example, writing software that manipulate then text or anything else, is arguably not for the tool making itself, even though it can be fun. So for example, writing another like kind of Photoshop or kind of GIMP or Krita for text or for any different media, the very process itself normally and hopefully changes the way one thinks, and again, hopefully for the better. And I think it's an active process. Basically, you can, of course, one can describe it, but until it's actually done, and again, however way it's done, then I think also not making it. For example, you were kind of mentioning how people just like install the software and they click and they use it, and I think just using it, well, it's probably better than nothing at all. But ideally, at some point, the person going to the About button of the said software is like, oh, it's missing this. Can be through a plugin system, or how can I extend it? And I think if you're an expert in your craft, and again, whatever that is, can be woodworking, can be writing text or software, etc. I want to bet, and I haven't read it, so if any of you have reference on this, I'd be curious, that in order to reach the top of your craft or a certain threshold of mastery, you need to be able to modify the tools themselves that you rely on, if not design them entirely, but recombine them somehow.
Yes, I just want to throw a few things in there. Some of it is obvious, and that is getting rid of clerical work, drudgery, like the Mac OS. Goodness gracious, is good now compared to many years ago. The fact that it does autosave and all these things, little tiny things that truly augment not stressing about things. It's just built in. So that's one thing. The biggest problem I had with my PhD was not the thinking, not the logic, not the writing. It was the damn formatting. It had to be in this way, not just formatting in terms of the font and the references, but also the prescribed logical structure had to be this and that, right? There are a lot of things that we can get rid of in an ideal world where, people just write. And also, Fabien, there's a difference between writing for thinking and writing to communicate. This is very similar to Mark and Dave Millard's paper on 7 types of hypertext. Hypertext for thinking, hypertext for communicating. Maybe we can help bridge that gap, because I'm very lazy. So I don't like to write, to think, and then just write again. Even though I actually do it, I would prefer, if I write, do a little jiggle, and now it can be presented, right? So if we have more ways of doing rough writing, editing writing, if it was more integrated in a wider perspective, that might make sense. So many hands. Mark, and then Brandel, please.
Okay, I'll rattle quickly through 3 things. One, as I was thinking, as you speaking just now about the fact that, thinking, well, why have I gone back to writing essentially in plain text, unaugmented? And it's partly because rather than treat everything as a nail because I got a hammer in my hand, sometimes it's easier to start the writing, the actual communication, and think, okay, actually now I do want some formatting, or actually I want margins here, or I want all this other stuff. And it's not because I don't like the aesthetic beauty of it. I'm surrounded by many books that give me great pleasure, but the writing's more important than dicking around with the layout. And I think that's one of the unintended fallacies of one of the unintended mistakes of WordPress, because it's got the whole process upended, so you're fighting with the look of it. Someone mentioned recombination of tools, and I think that's an interesting. In obviously, to become expert, you probably need. I think it's as Fabien said, it's probably a marker is that you start to need to build your own tools, and I think that's something we should foreground more and say that's a positive step. If you're getting to the point where the things you're using can't do what you want, that's actually a good tell back to you that you're beginning to have better understanding of the sort of métier in which you're working. And I just pose one other passing comment, which is a sense of, I sort of share your pain about writing a document, but I suppose I came to it a slightly different way. I mean, I had the same pain, but I think what I've learned from years of writing documentation is that, am I writing to scratch my own itch, or am I scratching to write to communicate with others? Because if you go down the latter route, you only know it's done when people stop telling you it's rubbish and they can't find anything. Which is why some of these sort of formats, railings, that though we may, unintended pun, though we may rail against them, actually have a purpose. Because if I write something that's so in my style, how many people will understand, engage with it? Our presumption is that ourselves at our best and most expressive is our most understandable. And I'm not sure. I think experience would say that probably is, unfortunately, is not the case.
Yes, we all need to go and look at new lenses. All right, Brandel. Lenses for views.
Right. And so one of the things that makes me sort of try to play with or think about is like, what are the sort of the current crop of nominal tools for thought for is something that I've really struggled with. Like I think I've tried to use a Notion and an Obsidian here and there. I had actually installed a wiki, a media wiki myself for the purpose of kind of structuring and organizing it. And it just felt so masturbatory. I didn't know what it was doing for me and why anyone else would care about the things that I was putting into it and why I should care. So I replaced it with a blog. And that was interesting. And I wrote a bunch of things, but it was mostly, if I'm honest with myself, it was mostly the writing rather than the reading. There were a couple of times when people picked it up and were like, "Oh my God, he did a cool sim of shelling segregation." But it was, intensely like I very rarely wrote a blog post that didn't include. I never wrote one that didn't include a picture, and I almost always had a program in them as well. So they were like, here's a short programmatic sketch, and then a fairly long screed about what it is in a technical sense, and then what I think the consequences of it are, and to some extent, I still do the code part, and I don't spend as much time on the practical consequences. But yeah, like I don't. Back to like saying Photoshop or GIMP or Krita or whatever for text. Don't know what. I don't know what tools for thought are for. with Scrivener and Final Draft, I think, and Author make a lot more sense. But I'm actually kind of baffled and a little reviled by these other tools for thought. I'm sure people have come to useful things for them in business and stuff like that. But yeah.
I have thoughts. Mark, you go first.
Yeah, just quickly, because I accord with that. I mean, I look at the genre and I'm thinking, what's it for? And I can think, that looks like an IDE. That's going to appeal to coders. It's got a graph in it. It's got a directed graph. This is instant knowledge. All your work is done for you. And so they sort of place that. And I think this goes back to the fact that what's lacking, and this probably goes back to our education, not our practice, is learning to be more exploratory. And the thing that in the tools that I use in the community I work in is invariably the first question is, well, what are you actually trying to do? Okay, we know you got here because you're fed up with everything else, but that is not the answer. Where are the friction points? Is it the tool or is it your style of thinking? Because if you don't understand what you're trying to find, what you're looking for, then your tool will almost always be a poor match, because it will be designed for something else, because they're all designed for something at the bottom end. And so having some understanding of, why it is you wanted to write this thing or why you wanted to share this, communicate this to somebody else is actually remarkably useful, because it lets you go into the toolbox and pick out the right tools. So lo and behold, suddenly we're using a spanner when we've been using a hammer for the last 4 years and wondering why the nuts weren't going on very easily. And so often it's just that small change. And the interesting thing is it's almost nothing to do with the tools. And actually, there aren't that many versions out there. I mean, you get one thing that's slightly new, and then you'll get 40 looky-likey things, because that's a new cool thing, and then it'll go away, and a couple of months later there'll be a new thing. And having watched this sector for some decades, it's sort of quite depressing how little new thinking there is. It's normally, hey, I put a cool new thing on something else. And people try, they said, yeah, and I'm now using this other thing. What that shows is it's not really actually delivering much back to them. The draw partly is the ability to do is the possibility of the closeness to our associative thinking. So how do you capture the implicit rather than the explicit? And the problem is you tend to end up in a sort of force-directed graph and thinking, no, that's not how my brain is structured at all. But I think there has been some thinking, and the interesting thing, and it goes back beyond the birth of the web, and some of the older tools are actually much more richly thought out, and there are ideas in there. And again, it's not so much necessarily tool A versus tool B, because often it's an element of this and that. But the missing part possibly is the fact that we don't educate ourselves to think about the tools and what the effect they have on us as opposed to us on them. Right.
Yeah, thank you. So to answer Brandel's question and to address what Mark was saying, what do I use these things for? And I find writing a thought down, as any teacher will say, if you have a thought, if you have an idea, write it down. Write it down. Writing it down forces a structure. It forces you to look at how it hangs together or not. Very often I write it down and it's clearly rubbish. So at 56, my level of maturity, where I feel in my life, is when I have an idea for something, an insight, I want to write it down in a way that others and myself can read it. That's the problem, right? Because I feel that most of what I write can fit on 1 or maximum 2 pages. I feel that the 2-page spread of our book is an incredibly good knowledge space, which is why I'm so fascinated with some of the early ideas of HyperCard. Right, I really think text fits here. This crazy, stupid invention of a codex where you hide text behind another piece of paper. I mean, in one way, it's really backwards, right? It's like, I'm reading this, but there's something else, and I gotta, it's like wrapping paper, right? When you look at it, it's completely absurd. So in an ideal way, the way that I fantasize about this, I want to be able to write this cleanly with all the affordances, all the things we talk about, dream up better ones. But then the 2 things have to happen. First of all, you need to be able to find it. Right? Maybe I put it in your hand, fair enough, but you need to be able to find it again in the future if for some reason you want to refer to it. You need to be able to refer to it in a way that I can know about. And then maybe the hardest right now, which should be trivial, I need to be able to find it again, right? I need to be able to write, as I said earlier, and it cannot just be, as I said earlier in this academic journal, because the overhead of getting something into a journal is so much drudgery, right? So the basic, let's forget the word web, the basic threading of our dialogue is really, really difficult. So, so that's that. And just a brief other one, I think this is very much on what Mark was saying. I think the irony of interface design is the one who designs the atlas, the one who designs the information, learns to understand it a lot better than the one who just uses it in a semi-passive interactive way. So the act of recreating something or creating something uses your brain in a very different way than consuming it. So maybe that should be one of our guiding things for the timeline and so on, is you don't just see it going past like a Hollywood movie. It is something you need to put Lego pieces together so your brain connects in a different way. I don't know. Fabien.
Just a brief remark, when I hear also Mark mentioning like directed graph, and it's also Brandel before with a PM or PKM and masturbation. I think there is a bit of like an aesthetics of cognition that changes over time. And for example, one of the biggest representation, and I would be curious to know where that stems from. Is it from sci-fi movies, and then we see Minority Report or I don't know what, but let's say graph has been, and there is like also Latour in France. There were a lot of work on graphs themselves, and if you still want to represent, let's say, sexy information in 2024 that is still contemporary, that you will very often see like moving graphs, the nodes moving, the edges moving, etc. So I'd be curious, both if anybody here has some references on the evolution of that phenomenon, that cultural phenomenon, and probably a bit harder, what's the consequence of it? Because, for example, if somebody is not used to thinking graph, or they try to apply it in a problem where it doesn't make sense, and it's just because it's the sexy cultural thing of the moment to think in graph, they're going to think less efficiently, basically. But it's just like the pressure of trying to adhere to stick to that model because it's the hype of the sexy knowledge representation of the moment. So yeah, I'd be curious to see both, like what's the evolution of it over time and the cultural, like how does it spread basically from, and also what's the impact of relying on it too hard when you probably shouldn't do it.
Yeah, the book I linked, Lab Coats in Hollywood by Kirby, it does a good job of talking about the relationship between scientists and informing movie science. And it's not exactly the same, but it's relatively close in terms of that. Julian Blaker at Near Future Lab also has a lot of. I think his PhD was on the reality effect and sort of constructing sort of canonical realities through media for what people sort of will then accept as being real. What I wanted to talk about was, on the one hand, I still stand by the idea that a lot of use of things like Obsidian and other things are sort of self-congratulatory and masturbatory. But on the other hand, I also know that that's not a small component of the motivation for people doing things like podcasts and blogs. And a lot of people complain about men doing podcasts when they really just need to talk to a friend. And it's sort of a similar refrain was the case back when blogs were sort of in their ascendancy as well. And so, like, on the one hand, I'm saying people should do more of this stuff. On the other hand, I'm saying that they're silly and show off. And I kind of can't have it both ways. One of the things that is more challenging, perhaps, with an Obsidian sort of Obsidian artifact, is that I don't know what it is and what other people are supposed to do to plug into it or consume from it and other things like that. Whereas with a podcast at least, it's something that people construct and then they deliver on a regular-ish cadence. I don't know how frequently people who are not committedly good at it, produce that media and get it out. I know that people had blogs, but fully 3/4 of their posts would be about apologizing for not blogging more often. So that's perhaps not an important thing to be able to augment and enhance, other than maybe giving them the ability to decide whether they really do have a blog. But more sort of concretely, like tools for thinking lead to extrinsic action. Tools that augment our relationship with text ought to have the ability to construct something, and resolving on that, like Mark was saying, what is it that you're trying to do, is an important part of it, and keeping everybody's eyes on the prize of what it is. So, a writing tool, a tools for thought tool that actually does, you work with it and sort of shake it a little, and like scripts or an outline for a season of a podcast that coming out would be a valuable sort of extrinsic goal, something that is aside from sort of simply working with the tool for producing for the sheer joy of it. And yeah, like there's a big challenge in that a lot of the time, sort of similar to Paul Graham's refrain there, that like people are so attuned to expecting to consume a lot that they don't expect to produce a lot, and that there's this increasing gulf between what they have the capacity to produce versus what they have the option to consume. And there are real challenges there that are not just because the people who do it are the best in the game, but also because we show them the absolute last mile, the very, very last moment that a piece of media exists. And if they were only to see some of the garbage that it goes through, some of the absolutely illegible states, then they would be like, maybe I can do part of that. So there's a media landscape aspect to the poverty of production that we sort of reside within at this point. And I don't know whether that's something that's sort of within the purview of a tool to kind of mediate and describe and present as a component of the problem. But I would be interested in it. So just being able to show us like, hey, so Moana is this movie, but it was also these gray boxes, and it was also these chicken scratch notes on a napkin, and there were years and hundreds of people between them. I don't know. Like if you want people to be able to think, if you want people to be able to produce thoughts, similar to like my snarky comment about Roland Allen's book being maybe 100 pages too long, like the simple sort of accepted canonical shape of well-formed, well-resolved information is itself a challenge, like a stumbling block for people to be able to get from A to B with regard to it. So maybe we, in order to build better tools for thought, people need to be able to countenance publishing and producing worse thoughts.
Yes, that was a lot. A few things. One little small thing that I posted up here and then I forgot about, and that is right now my programmers are working on having another typeface, monospace, or whatever for code in the book. It's turning out to be really difficult because of dependencies and weird stuff we don't understand. So I've told them to kind of hack it. So when you're in author, it'll look like whatever, maybe blue, something, whatever. But when you export, it will then take on the characteristics of the font to the size you want. So what I'm wondering about is one thing we can do now, of course, which is easy to forget, you can select any arbitrary text in a document and run an LLM on it, which is really, really cool, right? And Marcus repeatedly, in the best way, talked about writing for different, read by computer and in different medium. Maybe we should present the code in the books as an easy to select and run thing. So maybe it can even be pseudocode. So you select it and then you give it to, it is there an expectation that in an external tool, you give it to an external whatever, AI or whatever to run it. Would that maybe be useful, programmer people? Would you want to experiment with that? The answer is yes. Anyway, something to think about, because, okay, I see you, Fabien.
Just quick one is, I mean, this sort of sounds essentially akin to what on a fairly pedestrian scale by comparison, something like Jupyter Notebooks is doing. That essentially you mark up the fact that these glyphs on the page are to be treated as code and run in a certain way. So the movement towards that has been well around for a sort of good while, and it's getting on okay in some parts of science, certainly, and I think in the fields of chemistry and some parts of physics. Is being used quite a lot. But I mean, it is, the thing that I've always wondered about is going back to this sort of form and function thing we touched on earlier is, so why do we have monospaced fonts for code? I mean, because a well-designed font, in the sort of standard serif or non-serif families, as long as things like quote characters are evident as to what they are. Because, of course, there's this whole freighted thing where we originally started with, only uppercase letters and very few things on our keyboards, I guess, in about the 60s. And so we're dragging all this baggage behind us in terms of our expectation about what code should be. But I still find myself wondering, does it actually have to be in a monospaced font? Though one point is that in some languages, white space is absolutely will just break everything if you don't play by it. So if you can't see that a space is a space, that's bad news. But perhaps there are other ways we could get around that and still have a nicer font. I don't know.
Right. So that was interesting, Mark, because the thing is, yes, you can select the thing and have the thing go, but we could equally also tell the reader, the machine reader of the document, that any text that is marked up in this way is actually code. Right? So that means we could have a lot of fancy stuff going on, because just the fact that we can tell LLMs now stuff is amazing. I mean, as I think most of you know, if I take a PDF with visual meta into whichever LLM and say, what metadata can you extract? It finds all of it flawlessly and puts it in any format that I want. It's just crazy. It works. So maybe we can then make it clearer. For instance, I could imagine, Brandel, you say, here is the key bit to run a timeline of something. And, expect the document to be parsed and for that then to be live for the reader system. Because then also leads to the second question related to this, which is strongly agreeing with everyone talking about mostly writing plain text. Author is essentially plain text with a very few non-plain text. As I think if I paste a DOI or a BibTeX in the document, it turns it into a proper citation, which is then in brackets, so when it's exported, it does something. So the kind of writing we're talking about, what should we keep plain and what might we make smart? And smart can mean a lot of things. It can mean just, here's code marked in a different way. What are your thoughts on that? What should be plain? What should be smart? Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I started talking before I put my hand up. But my main thoughts are: I was at the World Wide Web Consortium meeting with the people who invented the internet, invented the web a couple of months ago now, I guess. And it just occurred to me that I have been writing web pages as long as they have, actually. And so I'm not to blow my own trumpet, I'm pretty good at it. And so I just want HTML. I just give me HTML and JavaScript, and then that's what I'll do. And you would be surprised by the results. I genuinely think, Jupyter notebooks are pretty amazing, but you do have to write in Python, and I don't want to write in Python. I know JavaScript, and I don't know what kind of limitations that in many ways, like HTML is not limited enough. There are a lot of ways in which you need to have sort of conventional kind of constraints around something in order for something to exist like an HTML document. And Markdown does some of that. Wikipedia has other sort of conventional limitations that are textual, and some of them are sort of like in terms of literal sort of character arrangements, and some of them are sort of broader metatextual sort of components of not having original sources, stuff like that. But I just want HTML and JavaScript, and I don't want an LLM involved. And if most people are not writing web pages like this anymore, but I get to in order to be able to demonstrate what the future of the spatial web is, and it's more than amenable to it. So it's I'm just really excited by that. I do kind of lament the fact that so few people get to write pages like that, because they are actually writing React for giant mega corporations and whatever, when in fact HTML is every bit as simple as it was when I started writing it in 1994. So yeah, that's my bit.
Okay, well, this is very exciting, Brandel. Let's say I decided to implement everything you said and make author able to do HTML, right? I'm guessing you probably wouldn't want to do some of the chore, like if a heading is heading level 1, just make it look bigger. You probably don't want hard bracket, H1, all of that. You probably don't want to see all the HTML all the time, right?
Well, so on apple.com, a lot of the time H1s are actually smaller because they are the title of the object, and then we want to have a big beautiful byline, which is like such and such funny pun.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. That's the expert level, and that's great. But what I mean is, let's say I decided to completely change author to allow you, when you want to add HTML, to do that.
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of things?
Right, and so yeah, so then the question is like, there's a difference between an HTML editor and an editor that happens to be using HTML as its substrate. And I think what you want author to be is the latter. You don't want to have, what you don't like pay. It's for authoring ideas. It's for the arrangement of those things. It is not another Adobe PageMill or whatever else people made, Hot Metal editor, things like that. So there's a challenge there in trying to keep those things distinct. And it's a constant philosophical challenge when you're constructing something which is in but not for a specific kind of technology. And I'm facing that with Universal Scene Description. I'm facing that with Model Element. All of these places where it's just like, well, it can run Doom, but it's not a Doom engine. Don't push it there. Yeah, I think that would be great. But what you need to be able to do is really clearly enunciate what it's not, and what you're availing yourself of by virtue of being in HTML, for example, but
Yes.
the way in which it's distinct.
Yes, but this is so exciting. Mark, you don't mind holding a bit longer, right? All right, thank you. Oh no, Fabien has his hand up too. Okay, so here's.
Don't worry.
Okay, thank you. So we try not to reinvent the whole world very often, but today is fun. We're kind of trying to do that, right? So let's not pretend we're making a new language or whatever, but let's say that we're creating a writing environment whereby you just write, but if there's something you want to encode, using the term encode on purpose, you are able to. And considering the power and flexibility of HTML, that might be a manner which you can do that, right? So continuing a little bit more with you, Brandel, what kind of things would you want to explicitly have access to? I guess maybe all of it always, if you control click or whatever, but just while you're writing first, please.
It's not merely conceit to say that I mostly don't write anything that's worth reading. Most of the time, I write for myself as memories of where to get back to, or to be able to work through something and to be able to be procedural. So I don't write the way that author is for right now. And so it's hard for me to see the bridge from here to there.
Don't worry about author as a thing, but just think of, you have your screen and you start working. I was just using that as an example, but just like, ta-da. What do you want to write plain? What do you want to write it? How do you want to put HTML in?
So natural to me. Like it's like Illustrator. Like being able to have, and with an Emmet system in place, Emmet is the abbreviation system that you use for being able to encode HTML tags. So you just literally write H1 and it produces a closed block that the text the cursor caret is in the middle of, so that you have the ability to do that. You write h1.main and it'll say h1 class equals main, and you sort of drop it in immediately. So IDEs are phenomenal for that. What it doesn't do is have the ability to reconcile interrelationships between things, particularly within prose. Auto abbreviations, Emmet's IDEs, they have the ability to go like, there are some keywords in here. So maybe when you start writing document.query selector or some specific thing that happens to exist in your code, then we can autocorrect that. We can autocorrect or sort of suggest that. And, you know, most people would throw their IDs out of the window if they didn't provide that basic courtesy these days.
Brandel, point of clarification question before we go to Mark and Fabien. Things like a heading, you still want to have the ability to use HTML for that. So even that, you wouldn't just, this is a heading and this is bold. Is it special things you want HTML level control, or is it basically everywhere?
Gets back to what it is. What is the point of the writing? And most of the time that I write these days, I am arranging my thoughts actually for a keynote. So, you know, I've been doing an increasing amount of presentations to people, the .DC thing, to various aspects of leadership. It was very exciting. Apparently, there was a thing that I built last week. The thing that I said was beautiful, maybe a week before, that I was really excited by. I was going to be able to show it to my senior director sometime in the next couple of weeks, but instead I've been pipped to the post, and so he showed it to our new senior vice president. He was looking around for a sizzle reel of things, and people suggested that he used that. So that was really exciting for it to be sort of so clearly high value. But what I tend to do in a keynote, I tend to put like no more than 10 words on a slide, and then spend a minute talking to that slide. So there's a real distillation of what it is that I mean by something, and then try to boil it down until it is all but illegible from the slide, so that the words just represent an anchor to what it is that I'll expect to be talking about while I'm on that slide. And I'll write notes for it, but you know, whether they're heading level 1 or whether they're bullet points is really more to do with stylistically what's going to help with my verbal flow as I'm sort of speaking to those points. Yeah, so it's an interesting confrontation that I don't have a good answer to. Sorry, I will yield to the queue.
that was really worthwhile, because this is such a key aspect. So thank you, Mark and Fabien.
So looks as though if I'm on this, actually just to speak to this last point about, well, you know, writing and where the HTML fits, I'm just going to share for a second, because remember to press the share button. Okay, hopefully you can see this. Now, it happens about what I'm writing about here is actually fairly technical, but how everyone, the rest of the world gets it like this is HTML, which is here. And this is sort of what I've gone back to. So there's a little bit of light formatting here. And that's a bit codey, that bit. But if I just took, you know, another bit of writing, it's all there. The fact that you see the code tag turning up is because I've been using this tool for 20 years, and now I could just put in a code font. I could put in a monospace font, and the export would know, and it would just stick it into, effectively would code it up for me. But this sort of setting, I must say, I sort of quite like, and it's come to be very natural. I mean, I don't know when Brandel started. I guess I did my first. I think I did my first web page in about '94, and it was awful in both senses of the word. It looked awful, and it was awful to make. But I can see utility. I mean, stepping back to you mentioned sort of Jupyter notebooks and Python. Well, the R community have come out with. I was looking for a book. So this book is actually written in R book down. This is sort of dog feeding exercise, but leaves me cold because it's such a lack of vision. What they think they're doing is making books. So really what you're doing is taking a bit of code and something to make it some LaTeX that you print a book out. And I think that really misses the point. And it's something I'm in the data project I'm doing at the university, is trying to get people to sort of just think a bit more, because I can't remember, I think it was Fabien showed us a site by some guy who's doing amazing sort of simulations. I mean, I think that's where the code comes together. It's not like a learn to code book. Here, take this snippet and run it. It's actually where doing something codey can show you something, or that this picture that looks like a chart, bar graph, actually sits on top of this, million lines of data table. In fact, you can just sort of step through the portal and you can make this come alive, which, I mean, I'm conscious, and something touched on it earlier, is this way that, we make everything sexy by making it a graph that moves a bit. But so there is a sort of grey area in the middle, but also just being able to see things or vary them allows you to have some understanding of the. It's a bit like close reading the text, being able to tinker a bit with the data. I know it's something most people do, but mainly because they never get the chance to, and they're told it's too difficult, or it turns up in a table and they don't understand that. But actually, I think it's the same experience. I'm having spent a lot of time unwittingly looking at data. I think it is that, when you get close in, you just see such a different world to the bar chart that somebody else put up based on the same thing. So I think that's where being able to sort of encode things. I don't think there's anything new or radical about the hinting of it. I mean, part of it is just deciding how visible the codey part wants to be. So you can have something that looks like a writing tool, or it looks, because I think Brandel's right. You don't want this to be a WYSIWYG sort of page editor. That really, really quite a nice way to do things. That doesn't mean that you can't take that same text and prettify it to the nth degree in design tool like Illustrator or something, if that is the need. But in the more quotidian sense, when you don't have that time to do it, but you want to communicate effectively, I think anything that lets you sit closer to the sort of associative train of thought that we often have about something, that's good. Because I envy the person who sits down and the only thing they ever write springs fully formed from their mind. There are people like that, but there are not many of them, and it's often even then that the ability to do that is within their field. So if they're a journalist, they might be very good at just pulling out an article, but they might be rubbish at explaining to someone how to deflat pack furniture. Anyway, I'll shut up there because Fabien's got his hand up.
Yes, and I'm back, and thank you for that, Mark. Next week there'll be fiber. Okay, Fabien, please.
Yes, I think it was a lot of things were said. Initially, my hand was up regarding what kind of content or how to get a usable, how would Brandel write, basically. And I think Brandel answer was HTML, with the little warning that I wanted also to highlight is, for example, not necessarily HTML isn't necessarily React, but in practice, I'm wondering how many pages on the web that one is not writing but want to parse are not like just mentioning it. I'm getting nearly a headache. I mean, there are a couple of pages that can be parsed, but overall, the ones that are semantically meaningful, because like it can be parsable, like you will get your data somehow. But a lot of it, like it's the div versus table versus span versus like the way you can get the content that is visually the right one, but then that is semantically meaningful. I don't think there are a lot of people on earth that write HTML this way. There are some, but I think it's very few. So what I end up wanting from somebody who wants to read content, let's say, I don't want to say pages, but content, Yes, I can have, let's say, HTML or PDF or whatever, which again, it will be like the way the layout has been done one way by the author, but I want the content too in a way that I can easily tinker with, play with, even if I never do it, but hopefully I will. So what I tend to find myself more and more is I will have the content with the layout, so the image and text are positioned the right way, maybe the code blocks, etc. But I will want also the constituents of the pages, for example, in JSON, because then I know I will somehow and relatively efficiently get that content and then basically reformat or program with it. So I need, again, the whatever the person imagined it would look like, but also the way that I can reshape or process basically. And it's been very painful for me to, like, I don't want to go in to look inside your web page and see, oh, it's this. I mean, very often it's horrendous. Like the again, there is no semantic meaning. It's like a class from whatever is the trendiest CSS engine at the moment, and it has like you're down the Yorkie at I don't know how many nodes, but it's just ridiculous. And then the names themselves are not human readable, like they don't make sense. So but I'll manage if I push myself. I made like just I think I wanted this 3 days ago. There were pages that list movies, and then what I want to do is have the ranking or the IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes score, so that if I have 100 pages or 100 list of movies, I don't care for the name, I don't care for the cover. I want to see what other people think about it. And eventually, we rank them or reorder them based on this. And then, yeah, I did it, and it wasn't too hard, but it should be much easier, and it should be for like any kind of content, any page. And for this, sadly, I'm rather confident. Like, I don't think the HTML on the state of the web currently does not do that.
Thank you, and there will be questions and comments, but Chris obviously waits until 10 minutes to the end to have this firecracker of a comment. Please read that out loud. I think that is really provocative and useless. There you go. Useful.
Yeah, is of course out of my worldview of how technology ought to be, but part of my idea is sort of if we can standardize and universalize the way we connect information, data, text, etc., treating everything as a graph versus a file or a document. Everything else can be layered, so we can have annotations to add semantics, style, etc., and then build compositions of the small components. So probably the most provocative part is the statement that embedded markup, it should be considered harmful, in like the old CS meme. Because it's so easy to weave when you're working with graph data. Everything can be externalized and make pure content more reusable. So it doesn't mean that the function that we use markup for is gone. We still rebuild that, but everything is as an annotation and a composition. So that's kind of the general thought there.
So that's beautiful, and it kind of goes to the opposite of what we were talking about earlier, which was experimenting and who cares if it can be reused. This is exactly the opposite, and therefore just as important, obviously more important in many ways. I would take issue with embedded markup considered harmful. I would contend that it depends how it's embedded, right? It needs to be removable. I really believe in, obviously, my approach to visual meta, stick it at the end, where it can be entirely thrown away if you want to. But to have everything on a different server, I know I'm a little bit of a straw man. But in kind of closing here, I do think, Fabien, if you forgive me, our prototyping has to happen, and it has to go in crazy areas. It is our job to go into the wilderness and find out where we shouldn't go. So failures in prototyping, as long as we write them down somewhere are important. Doing esoteric thing, finding crazy new people is important. But at the same time, when it comes to the useful stuff, I really do believe we can become successful. Maybe one of our tiny ideas will grow. I mean, I had a meeting with someone today because this is Jonathan Finn, who's helping with the book. And we got a manuscript in from someone, and the citations were just plain text. And he hadn't actually seen the basic thing of pasting in BibTeX and having it automatically become a citation, right? These are tiny little things that over time may be used because it's bloody obvious, right? So if there are little things that we can think of along what Chris is saying here, if we decide on a standard and not a world-changing Microsoft must listen standard, but something that is useful, you know, we have the network to communicate this to other people. I don't think we should be shy of dreaming because there's hardly anyone else trying to solve these problems. So that's, in a way, it's not arrogance, it's taking responsibility. Over to you, Mark, quick.
I was just going to reflect on the cruel irony that I mean, I agree with much of what Chris has said, but I mean, where we are with HTML was, you know, some false starts at the time and technical limitations. So we ended up with all, you know, all the markups in the document, but the links aren't. You know, some of the hypertext actually got right in the first place. So you want, you know, you sort of you don't want the links embedded because you want them separate. So you can. So in other words, you're not littering stuff around. And there are people looking at stuff now, you know, the Stenoff metadata idea. There's no reason that you have to use it just for metadata. You could use it to mark all your, as it were, your markup, the way you'd write standard tags at the moment. In it, so the technology could take care of that. But it's a mountain, you know, in terms of the status quo, that's an enormous mountain to climb. But I'd agree. I mean, I think a real key thing is to make more use of linkage and giving people tools to understand either the explicit links that they've made or given, or surface the implicit links that they have discovered and wish to pull apart. Because so inherent in that is a step away from our hundreds of years of long form text thinking. So, you know, we took the verbal stories. We took one strand out of that. We made it into a storybook, and we wrote it onto a succession of bits of dead cow. And that's broadly where we are now. We know different, but we don't. There are very few tools that allow you to write in a form that isn't predicated on there being a sort of the bottom of the drain is a long form document, and I think that holds us back. Because a lot of the interesting things we want to discover are multifaceted and have multiple narratives within them.
Quick question before Brandel. I'm just writing a list here because you said implicit links, Mark. So when you copy something and it does something, like the BibTeX becomes a citation, instead of plain text, quick, what should we call it? I don't want to call it smart text.
I'm not quite sure. I mean, the problem is that if you use something like Word, there is no BibTeX. It has no concept. And one of the reasons stuff turns up as text is because... I'm just talking
about the notion of pasting something that is a knowledge object, like into author, just not Microsoft Word. Because
does it have to have a name? I mean, in a sense, really what you want to do is you want to shift the needle where instead of it needing to have a name to live amongst all the crap we have at the moment, what you really want to do is you want to shift the norm.
Yes. Well,
to where the sort of the base level copy.
Yes.
So in that sense, I'm not sure giving it a new name helps you because you're just another wannabe candidate to change things. I think the thing to put the shoulder to is to actually move the norm, to understand that when you copy something in a grown-up authoring tool, that what it takes is all this extra richness behind it.
Yes, but we had to have horseless carriage before we had just cars. And as Karl says, pasting with formatting or not. There is, you know, rich text just means bold, basically, you know, that level of formatting. Anyway, that was a bit by the by, and thank you for all the comments here. Brandel, please.
So while I'm sympathetic, Chris, to, you know, embedded markup considered harmful, and I love a good callback to Dijkstra I also don't know where it necessarily leaves us. One of the things that reading about text and reading about writing and for the last few millennia is that we often underestimate how many times something was rewritten and transposed and altered in order to get it into its final legible form. And so rather than saying we don't put markup in something, having some kind of reasonable and legible flow for externalizing or processing texts in such a way as that it then becomes that would be sort of maybe a better goal than to say that it's never supposed to do that in the first place. And to me, that's kind of like what the way that Scrivener approaches writing narrative fiction or narrative or whatever is the way that you compose things in blocks in this way, and then you understand it to undertake a process to reflow it in a different way, because ultimately, at this stage, still people are still primarily producing books with it, or book enough kinds of thing. So yeah, I think it like making people aware that there is a mode and a way and a time that text needs to be like this, and there's a time when it's actually at cross purposes to its life as a piece of information for that to be internal to it would be a useful thing to be able to kind of dwell on, and how to take text and ideas through phases like that is an important sort of function of the tools.
So I think today was very useful. We didn't get anywhere, obviously, but we did get a better sense of the territory. And yeah, I think today's I will put on YouTube a little bit stronger, a little bit wider to get more people in. I think it's a good example of what we're talking about. So what we've learned today is we really need to think of how to augment the thinking of the author while writing, getting rid of all the practical nonsense, and how to augment their thinking is really, really hard, because obviously it's entirely political and moral how you want to augment someone, in what direction. You cannot augment neutrality, I think. We need to look at what it means to write, even if we kind of agree that a nice writing area is a 2-page spread, so to speak. How do we, if at all, make it dimensional? How do we make it dimensionable so that dimensions can be encoded and extracted? It's becoming very interesting. And of course, we're going to start experimenting with all kinds of AIs just to see what happens. And I don't mind if the AI produces all kinds of weird stuff, as long as it's noted that it is, because it is a time capsule of today. So if someone does it in 20 years with an entirely different approach and sees that a lot of our stuff was rubbish, that's okay, provided it is clearly differentiated from the actual articles that people write. Any other further thoughts on the thoughts of authorship?
Well, a quick one. It was just thinking when you talk about the augmenting of the thinking. I mean, so that I think practically it means where that sort of interacts with tools is the tools need to be better at bending themselves to the thinking of the author, rather than the author bending their thinking to the affordances of the tool. Now, I'm not suggesting that's easy, but I think the sort of the first step of the journey is to stop trying to do what we've done before. So in other words, the models we have are generally not helpful for us, because they have this drogue behind them of basically trying to knock out parchment or whatever. There's nothing wrong with the long form thing, but it isn't helpful for the sort of tools we're trying to make now, because they don't have the flexibility. They start with the premise that you go from the top left-hand corner to the bottom left-hand corner.
Yeah, but
that can be an output. The point is, you deal with that at the output end. You don't want it anywhere near you at the beginning, because it doesn't help. It just bends the thinking.
Wait, can you rephrase that? I may not have understood you properly.
Well, so one of the things we're touching on is the fact that, so there are occasions where you just want to write a story. and you go soup to nuts, and that's fine. But a lot of things are actually more complex, and especially when you're doing things that we're talking about being more in the realm of tools for thought and things, is that the thoughts they're often complex, bitty, they're missing parts of the map, they have interrelations, sometimes explicit, sometimes sort of guessed at. That does not go well into a white rectangle on a page, which is the sort of design zeitgeist that we're sort of locked into at the moment. By iteration, no one's fault, it's just iterated along the way. And I think the breakup and the more interesting tools I've seen are those that just let go of that. That's just an end. Making pages out of it is just an export process at the end. If you want it in that format, we have methods to do it, but it's not helpful to the writing.
So in the writing stage, then, how do you see, what do people write on?
Well, I think the people who stepped away from the white rectangle writing, for want of a better sort of classification of it, tend to be writing in for want of a better word, notes. So they're writing in discrete things. Now, how that's saved, whether it's a record in a database or lots of discrete files on their file system, is actually neither here nor there, because in terms of the model, they're all the same thing. What they're doing, they're effectively
they're writing in
using those are the atoms of their thinking. Some are bigger than others, because that's how it goes.
So they write in smaller rectangles.
No, I think that's I see where you're going with that, but I think you're clinging onto the wrong side of the pool here. The thing is that, let go of the rectangle. I mean, you could write in blank space or something if the rectangle bit annoys you. But the point is, what you're not trying to do is you're not trying to write it in a sense a page. What you're doing is you're writing something that is capturing the glyphs that you're creating.
You're writing many. Sorry for cutting in. It's just we're way over time. Yeah, you're writing many notes around, absolutely, and that goes to what I was discussing in the beginning, the importance of the origami of how you deal with those things. I completely agree, but it'll still have to be on a flat surface, and if it's not in a rectangular shape, it's going to be very badly using the space. There's a great app for the vision that allows you to finally put thoughts on the walls in the room that recognizes it. And they do have circles, and it's a bit ridiculous. I think we agree on that, Mark. I just wanted to get to that point of...
Yeah, and I don't think that, as Brandel said, I don't think the 3D is a big issue. 2D spaces are more than... Spatial architects been doing for ages, doesn't have a problem.
No. Anyway, by the way, Brandel, we are going to now do a few versions of the book, as we talked about a little bit before and after you arrived. One of them will be the mural. Can we use your mural? Could I possibly send you a massive JPEG and we do it that way?
Yeah, yes. It's the easiest thing in the world to produce something that constructs the mural-like kind of experience. So it's a toss-up whether you want to use what I've written, which is dozens of lines of code at most, or hand roll it for whatever other system you want it to live in. It's just yeah.
Could you, because you love me so much, could you write an article with that code in it? Proof of the pudding, all of that. Even if it's just introduction, it would be such a great example of what we're doing. Fantastic. On that note, before Brandel changes his mind, bye-bye, everyone. And if you haven't sent me something already, do. Bye.
Take care.